Hello everyone, our topic this week was requested by Rick Witt. We'll be going over the light and the darkness from the Destiny franchise. Spoilers for all things Destiny. So
the light and darkness are essentially the driving forces behind the conflict of the Destiny games. One cannot really be explained properly without discussing the other. So we're going to go over both of them today. In practice, up until very recently, both light and dark have simply been sources of power. For the Guardians, the players, the light is the source of their space magic. For enemies, most notably the Hive, the darkness is the source of their space magic. But there have always been hints hiding in the cracks of Destiny's unnecessarily obtuse lore that the light and dark are more than just nebulous sources of energy. And in more recent Destiny seasonal expansions, the natures of both the light and darkness have been further explained. It turns out that both light and darkness are, if not beings, then at least laws of reality with will and power to act.
While their history and capabilities are complex, powerful, and loosely defined, realistically, the light and the darkness themselves are fairly simple to explain, despite being wrapped up in enough techno-magical jargon to make yieldy Star Trek writers happy. Before proceeding, it is important to note that almost every scrap of information we have on the nature and history of the light and the darkness in Destiny comes from either the darkness itself or one of its proxies and servants. Despite this, the darkness does not paint itself in a more favorable light than the light, rather it paints itself as the better, truer, more logical force. Even so, since nearly all of this information is one-sided, it should be considered with a few grains of salt. Regardless, the darkness claims that both it and the light precede both time and reality as you and I know it. They began as entities formed from the mathematical realities underlying the foundation of creation without physical form or presence, but full of will and power, and bound by their nature to perform the functions for which they were created. In essence, both light and darkness are laws of reality or concepts of reality given sentience.
Way back, before reality and time began, light and darkness existed in a garden that represented the infinite possibilities of existence. The darkness stresses many times that this tale of its history is told through dumbed-down allegory because we couldn't possibly understand the true scope of its nature. The light and darkness are referred to as the gardener and the winnower respectively. The gardener, light, planted seeds and worked the fields of the garden in the morning, watching to see what would grow from its efforts. The winnower, darkness, would reap the day's crops at the end of the day, separating the wheat from the chaff. And this is the nature of their existence. The light, the gardener, seeds life, encourages growth, and watches with delight and wonder at the infinite potential the universe can create. In contrast, the darkness, the winnower, culls the weak so that the strong may have room to grow and survive. At the most basic level, the light believes that life can work together and thrive by working cooperatively, can create infinite possibilities. But the darkness believes that the entire purpose of existence is simply the survival of the fittest. Objectively speaking, neither force is inherently good or evil, both are required for reality to function. If things grow forever and never die, the universe runs into all kinds of problems, but if everything dies, eventually nothing exists at all. As such, the light and darkness are naturally opposing forces that help propel existence. But by their nature as sentient forces of reality, they are slaves to their own narrow interpretations of life. There can be no compromise, and while they might be able to understand the need for the other, they each stubbornly insist that their own vision of reality is the only correct version.
In this garden, before time and space, light and dark spent their time between planting and reaping, playing a game. In the real world, in 1970, a mathematician named John Horton Conway developed something called Conway's Game of Life, sometimes just called Conway's Game or the Game of Life, which is a mathematical game with 4 deceptively simple rules that propelled the game into motion. The only action a player ever takes is to set the initial variables. Afterward, you sit back and watch the mathematical pattern unfold. According to Darkness, they played an infinitely more complicated version of this game, represented by flowers in the garden, but which could still be explained using Conway's Game as an example. Light and Darkness set out a 2-dimensional board of infinite size, the garden, and then arranged flowers in the garden according to their whim. Once the flowers were in place, the game began following these 4 rules. Rule 1. A living flower with less than 2 living neighbors is cut off. It dies. Rule 2. A living flower with 3 or more living neighbors is connected. It lives. Rule 3. A living flower with more than 3 living neighbors is starved and overcrowded. It dies. Rule 4. A dead flower with exactly 3 living neighbors is reborn. It springs back to life.
Countless times, the light and darkness played this game, arranging flowers in an infinite array of configurations, but each time the game finished, the conclusion was the same. Exactly the same. At some point across the continuous growth, depth, and regrowth of the flowers, a specific pattern emerged, which is heavily implied to be the Vex species, with the single purpose of subsuming and assimilating all other life, until eventually they succeeded, and the universe, represented by the flower field, was left in a Vex-saturated homeostasis. The darkness found this delightful, as the Vex were the proof of the truth of the darkness's purpose. The strongest organism survived and thrived until all other life existed only at its whim. The light, however, found this continuously repeating result incredibly boring, complaining that because this same single pattern always consumed the field, it wiped out countless budding developments before they ever got to see what they could have blossomed into. Game after game, the same pattern won out, snuffing out any unique or interesting permutations in favor of this boring but effective design. Finally, the light had had enough and decided that to facilitate new growth in the game, they needed to add a new rule. But it would have to be carefully designed and completely independent of the other 4 rules, both to ensure that the new rule wouldn't be compromised and that it wouldn't throw the rest of the game out of balance. The entire point of this new rule was, in essence, to inject chaos into the game to break a gridlock, to ensure that there was always new life and new possibilities on the horizon. The darkness argued that all this rule would accomplish would be to unnecessarily lengthen the game, and that the outcome would be the same. The light disagreed, proclaiming that, "I am the growth and preservation of complexity. I will make myself into a law in the game."
To combat this, the darkness also inserted itself into the game as direct opposition to the light's actions in order to fulfill its winnowing function. It's important to note that the 4 rules of the game are implied to be analogs for the rules of reality, physics, chemistry, etc. This is why the light and the darkness are referred to as paracausal or acausal entities. Causality is simple, it's the idea of cause and effect, action, reaction. While the actual definitions for what it means to be a paracausal entity are never defined in-game, the prefix para means beyond, apart, beside, adjacent to, or the like, inferring that a paracausal thing operates on a set of rules in physics that lie adjacent to, but do not necessarily properly interact with, the normal physical laws of the universe. The prefix a means anti or without, inferring that an acausal thing functions without adherence to the normal physical laws of the universe. Whatever the details of the differences though, the effects of being paracausal or acausal are exactly the same. Magic. They don't call it space magic, but the darkness and the light are both the different sources of space magic as a result of their very nature and the way they inserted themselves into the game.
This insertion of themselves into the game wasn't a peaceful thing, though. Rather than calmly set up a new board, the darkness immediately attacked the gardener, beginning a war that would last from that moment before the beginning of time all the way to the present day in the Destiny games. It is very important to note that this battle destroyed the garden and that destruction gave birth to the universe. Little bits of life within the garden were tossed, flung about, destroyed, and scattered during the fray. Other bits of life actively fled the wake of destruction left by the light and dark, and by the end of that first fight, the universe had been created from the destruction, chaos, and fleeing intellect combining into the building blocks of the reality we now live in. The most important revelation from this event is that the reality seen in the Destinyverse is not just another simulation, not just another game. This is the first, last, and only real application of the game at work. There's no resetting the board for another game after this reality plays out. The darkness and light have committed themselves fully to this single game, making it the last and only game, and as such, one way or another, one of them will be proven right by the game's end. Or neither of them will. But either way, that will be the end of the game.
The darkness won that first fight, because inevitably the light would stop to offer peace, and inevitably the darkness would strike during the opening that such petitions gave. But the larger war raged on throughout history. Both light and dark traveled the cosmos, planting their influence here and there to ensure that their vision could succeed. The darkness counseled the right to rule and live by strength, while the light counseled that strength was found in cooperation and growth. The Traveler and the Black Fleet are physical manifestations of the light and the darkness, respectively. Technically, light and darkness exist in some degree in nearly every spark of creation, but the Traveler and the Black Fleet are either direct manifestations of the light and dark, or are direct servants of their will. Which is the case is not made entirely clear. It's also not entirely clear whether the Traveler is or was the only one of its kind, or whether, much like how the Black Fleet consists of numerous ships, there are or were a fleet of Travelers out there in the wider universe. There are accounts throughout history of Travelers visiting numerous civilizations across the vast distance of space, always pursued by the Black Fleet or other members of the Darkness's agents. However, Whether each of these accounts points to a single traveler or to several independent travelers is entirely unknown, as there are a handful of references that seem to indicate there is only one known traveler, while there are also a handful of references that indicate that there are more than one powerful source of traveler like light out in the universe.
Regardless of their natures or numbers, throughout time the traveler we know has seeded life across the universe, breathing life into star systems by terraforming worlds and uplifting civilizations since time immemorial, leaving once it was satisfied with its work and moving on to the next system, or leaving once it sensed the approach of the darkness and its agents. For the darkness's part, it performed a similar work, granting power to peoples in exchange for adherence to its survival of the fittest dogma. Like the light, never choosing favorites but rewarding actions that followed its tenets, while also actively hunting down the traveler and expunging any species it uplifted. Until finally, the traveler was drawn to the Sol system, humanity, and Earth. Something about the system gave the traveler, who is the only active voice of light we've ever encountered that we can be sure of, a sense of hope that it had long forgotten after so many defeats. So when the darkness descended upon the Sol system and humanity, as it had on so many in the past, rather than flee to the next system, the next race, the next chance, the traveler instead stood its ground and fought the darkness. What exactly happened next is unclear. We know that most of humanity was wiped out. We know that the darkness and its forces receded from the system. We know that the traveler survived, if only just barely. We know that it fashioned the Ghost, hundreds of thousands of smaller machines, gifted with the light and the power to create guardians, the last gasp of the traveler before it fell into a comatose slumber. We know that the traveler was still alive, but that it was significantly diminished, not just physically damaged, but much of its power cut out or stolen. We know that since the games have begun, partially due to the efforts of the player, that the traveler has begun to heal and awaken, and we know that very recently the darkness has sensed the traveler's awakening. By the current time of the games, the Black Fleet waits in orbit throughout the system, slowly devouring all that the traveler has helped grow. While the traveler heals and its champions, the Guardians, hold back the darkness. Will the last battle between the light and the dark, the final answer to their question posed before time began, be answered here? Or is ours just another battle in their endless war? Only time will tell.
And that's basically the light and darkness, forces for change and magic in the Destinyverse. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like and share it with someone you know might like it. If you have ideas for videos you'd like to see in the future, do like Rick Witt and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more videos, hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see our Let's Plays, follow the link in the description and subscribe to our Let's Play channel.
In the meantime, this has been
True Masters Morons, signing off.